So much for the introduction, and I'm extremely excited to be here today. It's a pleasure to join AxCon 2024. As mentioned, the title of my presentation is From Exclusion to Inclusion, Advancing Accessible Gaming Together. My name is Morgan Baker, and I'm a Game Accessibility Lead for Electronic Arts. A visual description of myself: I am a white woman with large brown glasses, long brown hair, and I'm wearing a navy blue sweater. A little bit about myself is I've been in the inclusion space now for about a decade. I became focused and full-time in accessibility in the past, like a few years ago, as interest and demand increased. A fun fact is I actually come originally from education, where I was an accessibility specialist in post-secondary contexts. I eventually became a game designer and accessibility lead, and now I'm a game accessibility lead for Electronic Arts. I've worked on many titles over the years, most recently being Star Wars Jedi Survivor and Dead Space Remake. I also happen to be deaf and disabled, and being one of the first deaf people to graduate from my undergraduate university. And I'm also a massive gamer. I was practically born with the Sega Genesis controller in my hands. I do this work not just because I'm interested in it, though, but also because it's something I fundamentally care about and have a deep passion for as a community member myself. So, diving into this presentation, the question I'm going to be asking us today is, how can we make sure we are directly involving the community when creating accessible player experiences, not just creating for the community, but creating with the community? The way this agenda is going to go is I will give an overview of the disability movement, its history, and contextualize it for video games. We will discuss what has happened in gaming so far, where we are now, and introducing how games have been involving the community so far, where I will talk about different strategies, case studies, and a discussion for the future. A bit of a heads up is I understand that some people will have an accessibility background while watching this, but maybe not games, and some people may have a games background, but perhaps not an accessibility background or not know a ton about like disability studies. So I'm going to try to make this approachable as possible by kind of giving some entry low-level information, just so folks are aware of what we're talking about right now. I also want to point out that I work at Electronic Arts, but I'm going to be talking about a ton of different cases from all over the industry, ranging from folks that are doing excellent work at like Ubisoft, Xbox, PlayStation, and much more. So without further ado, let's just dive straight into it. Understanding disability history and the movement. The disability movement is as old as time it is itself. It ramped up in the 20th century alongside global civil rights movements. Some say the key pivot is the 1960s, where the movement began to really take its shape. I'm literally right now just pulling from disability studies texts right now, where discussions have been included, such as accessibility and safety in architecture, transportation, physical spaces, equal opportunities in employment, education, housing, independent living, as well as freedom from discrimination, abuse, neglect, and other rights violations, as well as breaking down institutional, physical, cultural, attitudinal, and social barriers. That's a lot of different topics that were going on during this period. And we also have different like policies and legislation as a result, such as within the United States, we had the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, as well as the ADA in 1990. Though, of course, this is not contained to the United States. This is expanded all over worldwide, from Europe to UK to Asia to Africa, Canada, Australia, and so on. And it still continues today. The necessary movement for disability rights and justice is never over. But a key mantra that you will see throughout this movement is a slogan, and it's called "Nothing About Us Without Us." And this is a civil rights slogan from the disability community used to communicate the idea that no policy, product, or space should be made without the full and direct participation of those who it benefits or impacts. I'm going to give two very quick examples of this just so you can kind of see how this manifests through history. One example being Deaf President Now, which is a bit self-explanatory in its title, "We Want a Deaf President Now." It was a protest in 1988 at Gallaudet University, which is a university for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. The movement was successful in achieving its goals for more demand and leadership representation. Dr. I.K. King Jordan became the first deaf president. The coolest part to me is that the board of trustees became majority deaf, which is awesome. And all of this for the better of the community and the institution, which is now globally recognized as one of the best of its kind. Deaf President Now was important for disability rights as it symbolized a significant victory in the right for recognition, representation, and equal opportunities. And this is just one really quick story. I don't want to get too sidetracked with that. But I do want to talk about how we see this representation being demanded for throughout history. Perhaps a more recent and more digital example would be the ASL gloves phenomenon, where ASL gloves are devices that are designed to translate, and I'm going to loosely use the word translate, American Sign Language hand movements into written or spoken language. The popularity started in the 1980s, and we kept seeing it getting reinvented over and over again in the 2010s. And these gloves are criticized because they often solely rely on hand movements, ignoring the rich linguistical aspects and cultural aspects of ASL. You use facial expressions, you use body gestures. Plus, the nature of the product is one way. Hearing people can access what signers are communicating, but not vice versa, leaving us to ask, what is and who is this product really for? It should come to no surprise that the reinventors tend to be non-signing individuals that are not involving the community, where one deaf critic points out that the inventor demonstrating the gloves signs almost every single thing objectively incorrectly. Critics argue that the ASL gloves lack input from real-life users, risking solutions that don't meet the reality of our needs and the cultural aspects of the community, ultimately perpetuating the cycle of exclusion rather than empowerment. This well-intended technology that looks impressive, but it may not serve the community that it says it benefits. This is comparable to Deaf Present Now in the sense that it's the deaf and hard of hearing community, and I'm deaf myself, so this is why I picked those two as examples. But it's also a different context. We're talking about digital technology versus education, but the same fundamental problem, lacking involvement and participation of those who it benefits. Without involving the community, well-intended things for disabled people remain just that, well-intended. And with these examples and principles in mind, let's shift now the conversation to focus on video games. I just wanted to give this background and this history so we can kind of get into this mindset of where folks were and where folks are currently thinking about in terms of this movement. So how has this movement then impacted game accessibility? How do these principles come into play? Let's contextualize for video games. To give you an idea of the landscape for game accessibility, upwards to 30% of players in the USA and UK are disabled, as according to multi-year data from Newzoo. This includes hearing, vision, motor, mobility, cognitive, speech, and so on. From there, we can say 66% of disabled gamers report facing accessibility barriers as per a 2020 survey by Scope NPO. These barriers can include friction that can make the product less enjoyable or forcing a player to completely stop the game altogether. In fact, according to Muscular Dystrophy UK, which focuses a lot on motor mobility, 1 in 3 gamers in their survey were forced to stop playing a game due to this inaccessibility. Barriers are present, and players with disabilities want to play these games, and a lot of them. But I'm not here to convince you that accessibility matters. I hope if you're at AxCon today, you're already kind of convinced of that. But I'm here to just share that accessibility is as prevalent in games as any other field. But when we say making a game accessible, what do we mean when we say that? So rather than saying disability is a personal health condition, I'm pulling from the World Health Organization's definition by calling it a mismatched human interaction, where we say if disability is a mismatch between a player and the game, accessibility is the practice of reducing, facilitating, or removing that mismatch between a player and the game. It is not a player issue, it's an us issue, it's a product issue. And when this mismatch occurs, we often call this accessibility barriers. For example, if you're playing a game, I wouldn't say you can't play this game because you are blind. I would instead say you can't play this game because this game doesn't offer anything for accessibility to make it better for you as someone who is blind. Doesn't have menu narration, doesn't have audio descriptions, audio ping cues. It doesn't have anything that you would need. And typically, when we talk about video game accessibility, we can generally bucket it into 2 types of categories and strategies when you see it manifest. The first being options, like adding subtitles in a cutscene or narration in a menu or customizable controls, but you can also see it by design, like never conveying information through color alone. So instead of distinguishing two things through red and green, you can say, I don't know, like circle and square. Just anything else that doesn't rely on color, so folks who are colorblind can play. So you'll see this often through like accessibility options, but you'll also see this too through the fundamental design of the game. Just giving that context for folks who are familiar, like newish to this topic. Game accessibility has existed for as long as games have existed. In fact, in the 1950s, we have Birdie the Brain, which is one of the earliest publicly available computer games, and it includes options to configure difficulty for tic-tac-toe, making it approachable and inclusive to a variety of players as it was showcasing it. While in the 1960s, civil rights movement was brewing, so was game accessibility. For example, we have the POSM, the POSM, which was invented, stands for the Patient-Operated Selector Mechanism. It's amongst many at first that included a sip and puff input device. In fact, we see this evolve into video games, where just a few years later in 1989, we have Nintendo, which introduced the hands-free controller, where players can use a sip and puff controller for A, B, select, start, and a chin strap joystick for the D-pad directions, up, down, left, right. This adaptive technology, these options, these designs are prevalent throughout gaming history. Sometimes I'll get people that ask me like, oh, why is accessibility more popular now than ever? And I say, no, it's always existed. It's always been there. It's just, now we're being more conscious and thinking about it. And in fact, we start to see this consciousness when we fast forward to the early 2000s, where you begin to see more dedicated resources to just the topic of game accessibility. For example, we have 2003, the IGDA Game Accessibility Special Interest Group, which this is a resource for game developers of all backgrounds to learn, knowledge share, and uplift players with disabilities. It's no coincidence that many of the founders are gamers with disabilities themselves. Hashtag nothing about us without us. We also see a bunch of nonprofits that were uplifting, such as 2004 for Able Gamers, as well as 2007 with Net Special Effect, as well as one of my favorite resources, which was launched in 2012, being the Game Accessibility Guidelines, which is now considered award-winning, good job, y'all, guidance and examples of how to cater to gamers with disabilities and other impairments. You will actually see this 2000s work, and it just explodes into a ton of different games, and it carries over into a ton of different impact. We are being more conscious, we're being more purposeful about our efforts. And you also start to see too a rise in content creators focusing on accessibility, a rise in journalists, a rise in websites dedicated to the topic, blogs, streamers, and the list goes on. The impact to this dedication really does start to surface. For example, in 2014, we see one of the first menus dedicated to accessibility in the game Destiny. We also see more adaptive technology, such as the Xbox Adaptive Controller, which is XAC. And this is a device made by Xbox to help folks with motor mobility conditions, as well as others who benefit from the design. Throughout the 2010s, you see even more options and more designs. So, for example, pictured here right now, we have Forza Horizon 5, which has ASL, BSL options. That's so cool. You have Fortnite with the audio visualizer, which is helpful for deaf and hard of hearing folks, as well as The Last of Us Part 2 with their high contrast gameplay mode, which is beneficial for players who are low vision and blind. Game accessibility is the future of gaming hardware and software, and you really start to see this manifest. In fact, Steve Saylor presented an excellent talk titled Climbing Mountains, 10 Years in Accessibility. And if you're interested in learning more about this history, if anything I'm talking about right now makes you get really excited, I absolutely recommend you watch this talk. It talks about like the development of game accessibility over the 10 years, and it's a much to see. In fact, Steve points out in his talk the Uncharted effect. And I agree that this is a real concept. In 2016, Naughty Dog's Uncharted 4 released and included an accessibility menu that was very robust for its time. We're talking camera assist, vehicle assist, aim assist, lock on aim, changing repeated button presses to a tap, subtitle options, and more. It sparked a true conversation in the industry in this 2010s era. How can we make games more inclusive to disabled players and those who benefit from accessibility? In fact, 4 years later, Naughty Dog released another title in 2020, The Last of Us Part 2, where they took accessibility to the next level by including like high contrast modes, more subtitles, more remapping, and so on. But I do want to say this is not the only game to advance accessibility. Advancements are everywhere. We see Ubisoft's Far Cry series with controller customization, WB Games' Mortal Kombat, which has audio descriptions for all their cutscenes, one of the first of its kind. We see Insomniac Games' Ratchet and Clank with slow motion support. The list goes on. In fact, I'm actually looking at my notes right now, and I just have a whole list of fantastic games. It's really hard to just pick one or two or three, but we have a ton of folks ranging from AAA major publishers to indie titles that are making this movement. And my point being right now is that this isn't a core one-person thing. It's industry-wide, and it involves many game studios, developers, and champions. And this journey is far from over. It's 2024, and we still have games releasing with too small font size and poorly contrasting UI. But when looking at those who have pushed the boundaries in advancements, those who have innovated, those who have raised the bar, what do they have in common? Well, I guess it's in the title. I spoil myself. These games are creating with the community, not just for it. Game developers carefully listened to community feedback to improve accessibility. More so, many of these titles I've listed and many others included the community not just through things like playtesting, but through active production and development. As a designer myself, I come from a game design background and I've made accessibility features firsthand. I'll sometimes be working on something like, let's say, like a high contrast mode for low vision and blind pairs, and I'm wondering, how am I going to make this for my game if I don't ever talk to someone who's low vision and blind about this feature specifically? The industry can maintain standards. This is true, such as every game should have subtitles, of course. But game design is complicated and more than just a checklist, from genre to genre, such as a sports game like FIFA versus an action RPG such as Star Wars Jedi Survivor, or game to game, such as Apex Legends, a battle royale, compared to the other one, Fortnite from Epic Games. Often there is not a one-size-fits-all solution to addressing accessibility barriers. And by creating games with the community, we can ensure meaningful implementation and the highest quality products for all of our consumers. So, introducing that, what are some of the methods and strategies to do this? How are folks doing this so far? One method to create with the community is by providing community support and engagement. Often community members may participate in discussions, write articles, create videos, stream content, and engage with developers on social media to highlight the need for accessibility and provide feedback. We want to support this as game companies and engage with the community by constantly including, uplifting, and promoting players with disabilities. This can mean supporting disabled content creators, accessibility journalists, nonprofits, and other community groups focused on accessible gaming. So, one example then that we can do for this is provide dedicated websites for players to engage with for accessibility. For example, at Electronic Arts, we have the accessibility portal page, which is essentially a website where we have different pages dedicated to every single one of our titles that provides information about the options and designs available for that title. We have seen similar companies are doing the same thing, such as Xbox Game Studios having their accessibility support pages in customer help, and PlayStation Games also doing dedicated pages, sometimes with their help, or in the case of like Last of Us Part 2, the game website actually has a full dedication to just accessibility. The reasons providing dedicated websites is good is that it gives direct resources for players to use when discussing accessibility. It creates this shared language for developers and community members to use, and it showcases that the company does support accessibility. But when we think about this, we still want to provide a way for players to engage and players to talk and be more interactive. So another way to do this is provide channels for accessibility feedback. For example, at Electronic Arts, we have our EA Help, where we have accessibility forums dedicated to different topics, including like technical support, so if you just need help, versus bug reports if you find something's not working or broken, or we just have a general accessibility forums for players to chat with each other. Ubisoft customer support website does something similar, but they have an accessibility category when checking in for a ticket. And one of the most popular things I'm seeing now that game companies are starting to do, and I think is kind of fun and cool, is Discord is really popular amongst gamers. And so games that have dedicated Discord servers will also include dedicated accessibility channels to talk about accessibility, give feedback, and engage with others. This is especially popular amongst, I see, like indie games or newer titles. For example, recently the game Helldivers 2, they actually had a whole thread dedicated to just accessibility feedback and players chatting with each other about it. The reasons that it's good to provide these dedicated channels is that it encourages a culture where accessibility feedback is welcome. It can also connect players more closely with game developers. Yes, we are real, and so are you. And it drives conversations within the gaming community. It connects gamers together as well under their shared goal for accessibility, which is also an awesome added plus. In fact, I'm actually someone who's disabled and a major gamer myself. I have met plenty of now very lifelong close friends through these type of forums. And that's something that's really special because we're cultivating a culture and a community for this. But outside, we want to think about other ways because right now we're chatting about like digital ways to engage with the community. So another way is making sure that if you have a major game event, that players with disabilities and those who benefit from accessibility can engage with that as well. So for example, Gamescom, which is a major conference for video games, the Xbox booth included fully accessible wheelchair support, demos with adjustable decks, an Xbox adaptive controller setup, as well as my favorite sign language interpreters, which I was like, I remember going through and like my mind being blown by how accessible it was. It's very unique to be able to walk up to a booth and have everything available to you right away. Another example of engaging the community at major game events would be Respawn, which is an EA studio. During the release of Star Wars Jedi Survivor, we had a premiere, and think of it as like a red carpet. You invite some celebrities, you invite some content creators, and within this, we included inviting disabled content creators such as Steve Saylor, who's pictured on the bottom right of my slide. Reasons this is good is that the community is included not just in digital spaces, but the physical spaces too, where we talk about games. They're included in the celebration of launches, where they can get a sneak peek too and give feedback as well, which is really helpful for someone like me. And it increases accessibility awareness for disabled gamers and game developers alike. But we want to get more feedback and we want to have players be closer to the products as much as possible. So when community support and engagement in mind, we can provide review copies to disabled content creators and accessibility centered journalists. To name a few, we have creators like Deaf Gamers TV, Mike the Quad, Sightless Combat. We have journalists like Grant Stoner and websites dedicated to accessibility like Can I Play That? And Game Accessibility Nexus, all of which are driven by disabled community members. For example, Motive, which is an EA studio, when we did this for the Dead Space remake, we went out of our way to distribute copies to these content creators and journalists before the game's launch. This included them in our embargo process, and Motive made sure to try to retweet and boost as much as they could. It was extremely helpful for us to improve accessibility because we are learning about what was working and what wasn't working, and it validated design decisions while also giving us room for more improvement to think about game accessibility. So the reasons this is good for providing review copies and engaging players in this manner is that creators can share information about options with other players. It generates conversations about accessibility, leading to more awareness. It creates a clear avenue for feedback. Sometimes things can get patched later, or sometimes it's like, oh, that's actually something you need. That might actually be doable for us. And it supports the community itself through this opportunity. Uh, Between me and all of you watching, I actually read, I feel like almost every single review written by every single EA game that's focused on accessibility. And it's an absolute pleasure because the best way for me to learn is directly from the community in this way. And so it brings me an absolute joy to try to support in this manner. But of course, reasons we can't just do this to involve the community is that this is only possible after launch, and accessibility is hard to retroactively add. Still, it's a good way to support the community and raise awareness, but we have to keep in mind that this can't be the only way to involve the community in the full development of our game. Of course, I want to end this last one. This is like a quick side for community support and engagement is also just supporting organizations oriented to helping players with disabilities. For example, Full Circle, pictured here at the top right, where they're like all in a group picture. This is an EA studio, and they spend the day building assistive gaming devices for persons with disabilities as part of the Neil Squires Makers Making Change program. You also will sometimes see companies do like fundraisers for special effect, able gamers. And the reason this is all really good is that it supports disabled gamers who are supporting disabled gamers. And as a kind of side benefit, it provides a perfect learning opportunity for our developers. What better way to understand motor and mobility for accessibility than literally building the control devices themselves to then be donated to those players? In fact, speaking broadly about community support and just engagement, I'm going to leave you with a recommended talk by Jessica Roach titled Driving the Conversation, How Communications Can Accelerate Accessibility. It's at GA conference, and it's an excellent talk for you if you want to learn more about this topic. One method to create with a community as well is hosting activities and workshops dedicated to accessible game development that involves players with disabilities and those who benefit from accessible design directly. Activities can be guest speaker series, training sessions, and workshops can be like player interviews, player code designing sessions, and so on. I'll give more information. So one of the first that we tend to do is provide educational sessions to developers ran by disability community members and those who benefit from accessibility. For example, DICE, is a EA studio, and they hosted recently an event that invited 4 player experts to do kind of like a coffee chat FAQ about game accessibilities. Players came from a variety of backgrounds, some being accessibility consultants, others being more content creators, and they spoke about their experiences as gamers, advocates, and experts. Community members offered insights to us about their lived experiences and offered extremely helpful and practical advice too. This gave a space too for our developers to ask questions in a manner it's safe, anyone can ask anything here, and learn about accessibility directly. In fact, if you also, this isn't like a unique thing for us, you'll see other folks doing this as well, such as I know Tara from Xbox Game Studios, who is the accessibility lead there. If you follow her on social media, you'll notice that they host sometimes things called story times, which I like a lot, where they invite like devs with disabilities and gamers with disabilities to discuss their experiences. I bring this up because actually I was invited once myself, where I provided a perspective as someone who is a game developer making games, but also happens to be deaf and disabled too. What's that like? The reasons it's really good to provide educational sessions to developers ran by the disability community members is because it helps give direct learning and exposure to the community. Hearing directly from individuals increases empathy and it increases understanding in a way that no textbook or no just like, quick video can do for you. It also gives you a chance to get practical advice and guidance with very specific recommendations depending on how the session is oriented, and an opportunity for community members. It validates their own work as advocates and experts in this space. And an added plus is that it can be a catalyst for further partnership and collaboration. I can't tell you how many times we've brought someone in to be a guest speaker for something, only to hire them later as a consultant because, wow, that was really helpful. Tell me more. Then also too, who better to educate than those who experience the need for accessibility firsthand. We can also have activities and workshops that are not just general. So what is accessibility? Can you teach me a quick general education session, but something actually more contextual to our products. So one that is becoming increasingly popular to offer among some game companies is accessible design workshops. Workshops typically include inviting players for interviews, co-designing sessions, demonstrations, and so on. They're a ton of fun to run and a ton of fun to participate in. And they're typically oriented for a specific product and service in mind. At least that's how we do it. In 2019, Ubisoft Montreal published about hosting an accessible design workshop, and I'm just going to go ahead and quote one of the developers where he says, "We always talk about accessibility when we are making a game, but it's something a bit abstract. But today, during the workshop, talking with people with real issues but still want to enjoy our game is something that's super valuable." In fact, I'm going to use one example from Playground Games because this is just a perfect case study of this just working excellently. They had a workshop a few years ago where, according to an IGN article, it was oriented around Forza Horizon 5, a racing game. The workshop included someone named Cameron Akit, who is a deaf or a hard of hearing player and now a accessibility researcher in school. He got hired by PlayStation. Go Cameron, you're awesome. Over the past 2 days, he shared numerous designers his experience about like subtitles, about captions, and he had some shared practical insights for them. I'm going to quote an IGN article for this as well, where Cameron shared that if you are a sign language first language user, if you're deaf and culturally deaf and your family is deaf and you only sign, then English is your second or even your third language. And reading in your second or third language is an exhausting experience. Cameron is a major asset and a major person for the deaf and hard of hearing community and a major advocate for game accessibility in this space. And in fact, 2 years later, Playground reached out to him with, again, wow, this really resonated with us. Can you share more? To which Cameron did. They hired him as a consultant and they ended up adding ASL, BSL options. They had a gift first for its type. And in fact, it won a game award just a year ago specifically for this. So innovation really does come from accessible design workshops. So reasons this is good is you're interacting closely with players. It inspires developers to think outside the box. Workshops contextualize for the product to help developers understand priority, a sense of urgency. And it's especially helpful in pre-production, I must emphasize this, because it can help developers roadmap meaningful and impactful features. And it offers opportunity to co-design with these player experts. The last I'll touch on before wrapping it up is another method, which is creating with the community through user research, insights, and consultation. User research can be like player panels, including like accessibility personas, play testing, usability testing, and so on. Insights can include like accessibility quality assurance that involves player testers with disabilities, as well as consultation, which is consultation. I feel like that's explanatory, but involving accessibility experts with disabilities themselves, hiring them as consultants. An example I'll give you for including players with disabilities in user research is Respawn, a EA studio, had a playtest fully dedicated to accessibility for Star Wars Jedi Survivor, which is really cool for us. Players of varying backgrounds were invited to test and validate accessibility features, where personas were identified based off certain features and intended audience, and we partnered with Able Gamers to recruit players, reaching out directly to community members to identify those who can help. Insights help developers identify usability issues, barriers, and opportunities for improvement that may have otherwise been overlooked for us. So reasons this is good is that you can get clear usability feedback from a variety of players. The validation of design decisions is helpful, and its effectiveness for the disabled perspective can be verified and better understood. It also gives an opportunity to iterate on our designs and test iterations for further validation. And of course, it ensures that these features are actually meeting real needs rather than just like, this is a cool idea, hopefully this will work. And it can be done early in production, even by testing with basic paper prototyping or interviewing players about specific accessibility barriers. You don't always need to have a functional, fancy game build to run a really good user research study. Another one is just providing quality insights that involve testers with disabilities. Effective way to ensure that the quality is good for the game is to really hire people with disabilities to do this quality testing for accessibility issues. Who better to test than those who benefit and need it the most? For example, the Microsoft Gaming Accessibility Testing Service, stands for MGATS, offers accessibility testing based off of the guidelines and tags. And within this, to quote them, in the spirit of nothing about us without us, yay, A plus for that. They offer quality testing with multiple players with disabilities. And here at EA, we have used this feedback from these quality testers with disabilities to help better understand and improve our products. I know that other folks are exploring this as well. For example, Keyword Studios by Player Research, they also offer accessibility quality assurance. They do like one-off audits or embedded quality testing, and the services extend to offering support that includes consultants. The last, of course, is just inviting player experts and accessibility consultants to work full-time on your products throughout production. An example is Forza Motorsport, which is a racing game that has sightless and blind play. And this is largely attributed to Brandon Cole, who is a consultant that worked throughout production. And reasons that this is good to bring consultants is that they can help contextualize and be consistent throughout your product. It gives a level of intimacy and allows consultancy to be more in depth with this code designing. And it can be done very early and provide the best insights and often leads to innovation. So summarizing, we have activities and workshops, user research, insights and consultation, community support and engagement. And of course, there's much more, such as supporting community members as they create like codexes and guidelines, as well as involving employees with disabilities, ERGs, and special interest groups. But please never forget, you must compensate the community for their time and labor. Many will try to do this voluntarily. Do not let them. It's nothing about us without us, but it's also nothing about us without paying us. So they deserve expert recognition and should be paid accordingly. I gave many reasons why all of this is good to embrace nothing about us without us, but to summarize what the value is that it increases innovation, improves usability, ensures product quality, reduces compliance risks, and it expands and maintains a market for us. I've also stated a lot about what we have been doing so far, giving different examples from all over the industry. But what do we hope for the future of creating games with the community? So one is develop the muscle memory, make developers pause and think, am I involving the community today? I call it that gut instinct. Have I been nothing about us without us lately? Making sure that people are constantly thinking about embracing the sentiment as part of their muscle memory. Also embedding accessibility and normalizing this in development, normalizing these workshops, this user research, this consultancy, this community engagement, as well as expanding resources and services to do this. More services to cover for user research and testing, more resources to run workshops, and more for that. As well as I say, improve community opportunity and increase inclusive hiring. Yes, you can hire them as a consultant, but also, why not full-time? At the end of the day, every product should be made with the full and direct participation of those who it impacts and benefits. Accessible gaming is only impossible if we embrace nothing about us without us. But to be honest, every game should be focusing on the accessibility. This isn't like a special one-off thing that you just think about one time in your life. Xbox says games are for everyone. PlayStation says play has no limits. It's important to be conscious and be purposeful, but it doesn't have to always be about us. We should just be there by default. We should be part of everything. It's nothing without us, because everyone deserves to game, and players with disabilities should automatically be part of every single process. That's the conclusion for my talk today, and thank you so much for having me. I will be taking a Q&A now, but before I do that, my email address is momoxmia@gmail.com. My website is leahybaker.com, and you can find me on any social media platform of every name at momoxmia. Thank you so much, and I'm excited to do the Q&A. And of course, I'll make sure to check the Discord after this if you all have more questions. Always a fan of talking about games and accessibility.
Great job, Morgan. Attendees loved your content and have lots of questions. Here is the first one. From Danny, we have WCAG for web content, but should we have similar set of accessibility standards for gaming? Or will it hurt creativity, game design in this medium? Would appreciate your opinion.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So standards do help us a ton because it helps us give a shared and unified quality across games so that players can have met expectations. For example, games should be doing font size of X size, and you should be making sure that you're meeting certain contrast standards. So yes, it is helpful to have a similar set of standards. For example, we have something called the Game Accessibility Guidelines, which is extremely helpful. It's actually gameaccessibilityguidelines.com, which is like super that's helpful to find. But you can go there and you can see a list of standards that folks will use. And we also have something called the Xbox Accessibility Guidelines, which is also specific, and they have their own guidance on different standards and such like that. There are some standards that can be applicable to all the games. For example, a functional menu narrator, right? Or making sure that your subtitles are meeting certain size and contrast qualities. The idea is that, yes, it is beneficial to have this unified. But of course, I do want to point out, as you're already hinting in your question, that every game is going to be a little bit different. So you will find that methods to achieve accessibility may vary from product to product. And therefore, it's good to have this kind of like foundational standards while still inspiring people to go beyond that.
Awesome. Question 2 from Remy. Any advice about how to deal with certain accessibility options being perceived as giving unfair advantages in the context of multiplayer and competitive games?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. My answer to this is typically if you think something seems unfair or too difficult or not the right fit, it means it's not the right fit for that game. You can do accessibility using different methods for games. For example, look at Fortnite, where they have something called an audio visualizer, where they basically will visualize sound for deaf and hard of hearing people. This is super helpful for folks because it'll help them see the audio visualized on the screen, but you might notice that this design will have different methods from games to games, such as Assassin's Creed. Instead of using a visualizer this way, they'll do a kind of like point in a direction with like a subtitle pointing, like go this way versus go this way. And so the idea is, though, answering the question, is when you think that something's giving an unfair advantage, when you think that in the context of multiplayer and competitive games, and if you think it's not the best accessibility feature for that, it typically means we're not thinking about the right method and the right solution for that mismatch and that barrier.
Awesome. Question 3 from Cynthia. Do you have favorite resources, websites to find accessible games?
Oh, I have a lot of favorite resources and websites. I like to pick a few. So in terms of community driven, I cannot recommend enough caniplaythat.com as well as Game Accessibility Nexus. These are very, very helpful in terms of identifying whether or not a game is accessible for you. I also recommend, if you can, to check out, it's called Tanning Gamers. Wait, let me look it up. Tanning Game. It's a fantastic website, though. I'll post it in the Discord, so I'll just post all these in the Discord so you have it forever. But it's a fantastic because it'll actually check off which features are in which games, and it's helpful for you to understand, like, this one works for me versus this one doesn't. So definitely go there. Also, really cool, but PlayStation and Microsoft actually has tags in their stores too to check off certain features, like yes, this game has subtitles, yes, this game has menu narration, and so on. So those are also helpful resources when identifying which games are accessible.
Question 4 from Beth. Have there been any efforts to introduce more classes about accessibility design and gaming to game design degree programs at colleges and universities?
Yes, there has been. And in fact, I've been invited to speak at a few, and it makes me So happy. Well, kids, remember too, I come from higher education, so I selfishly love education, and I love that this is becoming more of a thing. For example, we're noticing at like CMU, USC, folks like that, they're starting to really add more accessibility conversations into their discussions for design. And I'm noticing too, there's like a couple classes that are starting to be dedicated to just accessibility. It makes me really happy, and they have like guest speakers and lectures and stuff like that. So there is efforts, and I can only see this increasing, which makes me very happy.
Question 5 from Patrick. Hello, how do you decide which accessibility features you should add to a game and convince management to give that game a budget to create all of those features?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's like 99% of my job sometimes. I feel like that's like everyone's job when you work in accessibility. So when trying to decide which accessibility features you should add at a game and convince management which ones to do, a lot of times what we think about is the high priority, the foundations first. Does your game even have subtitles? Does your game even have control remapping? These fundamental things that can open and have a high reach and a high impact for many players of all abilities and all backgrounds. From there, you typically have to like talk to management, and you have to have the ROI conversation of, yes, 1 in 4 players have disabilities. In fact, it's 33% up to. And so these are the conversations that you have to have. But a lot of times for me, and this is just true for any accessibility professional, is that you want to focus on the basics and making sure that's in first. And then from there, identifying the next path, the next critical path. I'm such a gamer, of which things would be most appropriate based off of that reach and that impact and in the context of the design.
And for a matter of time, we're going to get to as many more questions. But the next question is actually from Discord, from Iris O'Connor. What are your favorite games with accessibility options?
Oh, this is a hard one. Oh, okay. The one game that blows my mind. So I play like a lot of different games, ranging from like Baldur's Gate to League of Legends to Assassin's Creed. I play it all. But the one game that made my jaw drop was Stories of Blossoms. And this is developed by an indie studio, and it has everything. Like literally everything. In fact, they have like such simplified controls. You can like practically beat the game. I would have to double check, but you can like almost beat the game with like one input. And it just like literally drops my jaw in terms of how much accessible design and how much accessibility options were really embedded into the development process. And so this is probably the game go to if you ask like the best of the best or the one that makes you whatever. It's that one dropped my jaw, like literally just downloading it.
I'm going to try to get 2 more questions in. Question from Josh. When supporting fully keyboard accessible interfaces in PC games, should they resemble screen reader behavior as much as possible? For example, should UI elements be tab navigatable? Are there any differences to consider?
Yeah, so this is a technical question, and I'm happy to ask or answer more technical questions about making the games themselves accessible. But for this, it's important. I would recommend you going to the game accessibility guidelines and going to Xbox accessibility guidelines, because these will be the resources to answer in much more, I'm also looking at the time, in much more depth about how to make the game accessible for keyboard narration and how that functions with screen readers.
I think this should be the last question, and I think it's perfect because this is happening to a lot of different fields. Question from Jen. How are the seemingly industry-wide layoffs in gaming affecting the creation of accessible games, if at all?
That's a great question. And the layoffs have been extremely tough in games and has impacted everyone, including accessibility and making games accessible and inclusive. That's undeniable for us. But of course, I remain optimistic, because the one nice thing is that many companies in the video game industry still seem to value accessibility at its highest regard. And so I remain optimistic. I still see more roles popping up now than ever for game accessibility. And so fingers are crossing that once it'll get better in the future for that. But of course, just like everyone else, we have been impacted accordingly.
Awesome. Thanks to Morgan Baker for a great session.